You're listening to LeaderCast, episode 57. Welcome to LeaderCast, Transforming Missions podcast with Tim Bias and Sara Thomas, providing you with insights and resources you need to lead a movement of Jesus followers. For the past 2 weeks, we've been talking about rumbling with vulnerability. Let me remind you that rumbling with vulnerability is about having real, honest conversations where we listen with the same passion we want to be heard. It's about having conversations where we stay curious, lean in to seek understanding, and show up without preconceived ideas. It's about listening closely. A rumble says, I care about what you have to say. I trust us coming together to have a real, honest, faithful conversation about things that matter. In episode 55, we talked about some of the emotions that can bring us to fear and self-protection and keep us from rumbling with vulnerability. We talked about why it's important to be more aware of those emotions and what we can do as leaders, and we gave you a tool to help you begin to rumble with vulnerability in your teams and groups in the local church. In episode 56, we talked about psychological safety, especially when we're seeking to rumble, and why it's important, and some of the objections to psychological safety. And we gave you 2 more tools to be able to rumble with vulnerability with your teams and groups in the local church. Today, we're going to continue that conversation about rumbling with vulnerability and look specifically at some examples of both and thinking, some examples of or thinking, and give you a tool to rumble with vulnerability so that you can live into what we're going to be talking about as gritty faith and gritty facts. And that term, before we jump into anything today, comes from Brené Brown. So we're borrowing her work and again applying it to the life of the local church and your work as leaders. You can find show notes for this episode at transformingmission.org/057. So we thought that to get started today, we'd talk about 2 aspects of the Methodist tradition that John Wesley gave us that have been important to who we are and our identity as followers of Jesus. So, Tim, you want to lead us into that?
Thank you, Sara. I'll try to lead us into what we have known as Methodist, as our identity of personal piety and social holiness. John Wesley, when starting the societies and class meetings, said there were 3 things that we usually would need to follow. Do no harm, do good, and pay attention to the ordinances of God, which then were divided into acts of piety and acts of mercy. And so part of our identity as Methodist has been holding in a good way, holding in tension personal piety, which is our inner faith, the part of us that's centered upon Jesus in such a way that we're shaped by Jesus, and our social holiness, how we are engaged in the community or with people that live outside of the church. But there's a place where we have our inner life and we live it in a social context. And so that's part of who we are.
And so part of how I've talked about that is we're people of the and. And so as we continue this conversation around rumbling with vulnerability, that example that you just gave us, Tim, about our own Christian faith tradition, is a reminder in terms of holding space for being able to rumble with important topics in the life of our church. So we thought we'd talk about a few things that we may not have always taken that approach of the and. So first, we're going to walk through some pairs and give some examples of the dangers of binary thinking when it's one versus another. And then we'll walk through those same pairs and talk about what happens when we hold the tension of the and. So let's jump into some of those examples. So let's say you are at a church and your finance team comes together with your worship team, and your worship team says, we'd really like to host a worship experience. We're going to need to hire some musicians, or we need to buy equipment. We need to be able to promote this. And this is, I'm just going to say, we need $3,000 for it. And the finance people say, we don't have money to do that.
And the music people will say, without the music program, you'll never have money to do it.
And so what we just demonstrated very quickly is what happens when finances compete against worship or creative arts. Another way that it might show up is, I call it the spenders versus the savers. And this might come up if you are fortunate enough to be at a congregation that has an endowment. There are people that want to spend that endowment down. We have this money for a reason. It was given for a reason. Let's use it. And then there are those who embrace the fact and celebrate the fact that we have an endowment and we need to grow that endowment and save that money.
Yeah, I've heard that, Sara, expressed in ways that we need to save the money for a rainy day. And I've often asked, how hard does it have to rain? or other times, if we spend it, we won't have it. And I think that goes to your point of, we've got an endowment, we need to hang on to it.
Right. And then this is probably my favorite one. Not in a good way, favorite. Internal versus external in the life of the church. If we're focused externally on the community around us, what about us? Who's going to care for us?
Yeah, we hear that. I have heard that a lot over my ministry, because I'm always trying to get the church connected to the community. And I've heard more than, and maybe I wasn't sensitive, I don't know, but I've heard more than I ever wanted to hear. Is there something wrong with us? Who's going to take care of us if we're going to be involved in the community? Why are you more concerned about people in the community than you are us? We've been here a long time.
You just illustrated why it's one of my favorite ones. Ordained clergy or pastors versus the laity. Well, if our pastors do that, what are we supposed to do? Or why are the laity doing the work that the pastors should be doing?
Yeah, don't we pay them to do that?
As if we pay pastors to do all of the work of ministry of the local church. Can't stop myself from saying it. Your pastor is there to equip the laity for the work of ministry. We'll come back to that in a minute. Another one, this is a nuance of the internal-external, focusing locally versus focusing globally. As if we focus on our local community, that means that we can't focus on the world, or vice versa. If we're involved in missions on another continent, somehow we don't care about the people who are in our backyard. Well, I hope they're not in your backyard. Maybe in your neighborhood.
Usually shows up of, why are we sending money over there when we have these problems here?
Yes. We've already named works of piety versus works of mercy, and how that may show up is Scripture more important than caring for people? Is caring for people and reaching out in acts of service, caring for people who are imprisoned, caring for those that are homeless, who are hungry, who are hurting? that's more important than reading and studying the scriptures, than prayer, pitting against the two. And so the reason we wanted to walk through that is to talk about some of the dangers of what we're going to call binary thinking, this or that, one thing versus another concept. And Tim, as we were brainstorming, I would say really rumbling around what this episode was going to be about, you made a point about binary thinking and what it leads to.
Binary thinking leads to blame. That we blame somebody, and which also leads to shame, which are both, in my thinking, negative to the personal piety, social holiness connection that we're talking about, or the nitty facts and nitty faith, gritty faith.
Gritty facts and gritty faith. and take that a step farther in terms of if you enter into a place of blame and people are feeling shamed, you are not going to be able to rumble with vulnerability. You have just ceased that from possibility in terms of engaging in those deep conversations that we were talking about, because you have just, what happens in those moments, and we talked about this in previous episodes, is people start to put on their armor and start to protect themselves from engaging in what is happening. I know when I'm going to go back to the internal-external conversation of an internal focus or an external focus in the church, and we're going to get to the and here in a second. I know in places when that has come up, I have had to consciously remind myself not to get defensive when people push back on that. I haven't always done that well. I confess that I haven't always done that well, because I believe deeply that we need to be engaged in the community around us, and that does not isolate caring for the people who are already a part of the congregation. And so that's what happens. We begin to not engage in the rumbles. The other thing that can happen is we begin to stereotype and to label people. Continuing with my example, she's only concerned about the community. She doesn't care about us. That's not at all what I said. Not at all what I said. And so there end up being winners and losers instead of coming around a table and having that conversation to get to a new place. And I would say it and say it this strongly, you end up having a fight or a shouting match instead of a rumble.
And one of the other things that happens with binary thinking is that we actually then create those who are on the inside and those who are on the outside. And so there are those who, and it's winners and losers. We can continue to go down that list. But one of the ways that I check out on those kinds of conversations is if I feel like not only if I've been blamed and shamed, but if I feel like that I've now been excluded, why do I need to even participate? So if I'm on the outside, I don't necessarily feel like I've got to fight to get back in. I'll just say, okay, you just go ahead and do it, and I'll do my thing.
So let's look at what happens if we step into a rumble and look at the gritty facts and gritty faith of what may need to happen with both of these pairs that we've talked about. So let's go back to the finances and a worship experience or music experience in the life of the church. What happens if I come and say, this is funny because I have no musical abilities whatsoever. If I come and say, we have an opportunity to have a worship experience, and we're going to need $3,000 to make this happen. Here's what it's going to look like. This is what it will mean for our community. Here's who it's going to connect us with in our community. And Tim, you play the finance committee.
Okay, I'll try. I'm usually on the other side, but the conversation that begins to be had at that point is that the investment that we then make, not only financially but in terms of mission. I think this is part of where, when mission is kept at the center, we can figure out how our money and our creative responses in worship work together.
So you might say, as someone responsible for the finances, is, okay, here's the facts. I can identify $1,500 right now that we could use for this. You're saying you need $3,000. Let's have some gritty faith and have some conversation around the table of where can we come up with $1,500 more to get the $3,000 to do this? Are there other places that people know we're not going to be spending money in ministry that we might be able to utilize that? Are there people that we know who would have a deep interest in this that we might be able to reach out to invest in this type of ministry? And you begin to brainstorm the possibilities of what can happen. So the finance folks name the facts. Here's what we've got. We don't have the $3,000. But at the very same time, they open up the doors of possibility of how might we make this happen? What might this look like if we thought about the different avenues that we might be able to find some resources. So that's gritty facts and gritty faith coming together in those two areas. Spenders and savers. Gritty facts and gritty faith. Yeah, take that one. You're laughing. Is there something that... Do you want to take that one?
No, ma'am. You're doing great.
He just ma'amed me.
I'm learning from you.
So the spenders and the savers. So the savers may say, "Look, right now we are spending 3% interest on the endowment that we have. We can look at what that will mean if we up that to 5%. And here's what might happen in the midst of that. The spenders may come and say, here's why we're asking for an increase. There is an opportunity to use the resources that we have. And again, you look at the gritty facts, but what's the gritty faith involved in that? Is it that the endowment folks say, you know what, let's do this for 1 year and see what that means. And we're going to need to evaluate because of fluctuations in the market. And now I sound like I know what I'm talking about and I'm totally out of my league.
But you do know what you're talking about. You have done this before when money would come from an endowment and then putting things in priority of how they best would be spent in terms of relationship and mission.
Right. That's another great example. So I had the privilege of helping to oversee an endowment that we had almost $100,000 every year that we had the privilege of blessing. And it truly was blessing organizations both locally and around the world with those resources. And that was exactly what we did. We put in priority based on how each of the organizations and each of the missions projects were helping us to live into the mission and how they were expanding the mission locally and globally. And so that was gritty facts. We knew how much money we had, but we also got creative in terms of what does that look like? We could have chosen to send $500 here and $200 there, and instead we said, you know what? Let's make a big difference in a few places and advance the mission in in deeper ways than saying we have, a laundry list of places that we can spend money. So what happens when internal and external come together in terms of gritty faith and gritty facts?
Well, it could very well be that the people on the inside, those who feel like that they've been there for a number of years and may have a higher priority in terms of ministry, that when their needs are being met, that they can be invited then into relationship with people beyond the church, beyond the inside of the church, so that the ministry is extended beyond beyond the church building. So it's not an either or, but it is, as we respond to God's grace, this is how we then offer that grace to the community.
Or here's a really crazy idea. In reaching out into the community around you, you're doing that with people from within the local congregations. And when I think about every time I have done that with people, there are always moments that someone pulls me aside and says, "Hey, Sara, I just need you to know." And that's followed by such and such lost their job. Our home is being foreclosed on. Such and such needs to go in for a biopsy. All of the moments that people are cared for, that if we hadn't been serving together, that moment wouldn't have existed. Now, sure, they may have still reached out and let me know, but in that moment, they were being cared for, even as they were helping other people. And so it's a false dichotomy to say internal or external, because the boundaries mesh and come together, and it's a both and isn't the hope that those that, I'm going to start preaching, I'm going to stop.
So when we move from either or to both and, we actually then move beyond a club mentality to a missional mentality.
Yes, that's a wonderful way to say it. So let's play with this last one that you introduced us to in the beginning, of works of piety and works of mercy. When those two come together in terms of gritty facts and gritty faith, we may see a need. I have a multitude of things that I'm thinking right now. Let's just take the infant mortality rate of children under the age of 1 in our city is higher than it should be. When there are babies who are dying in our city, in the United States of America, before their first birthday, church, how can we respond? And how I think about this is because of the love that I know in Jesus. I am called to share that love with other people. I am called to live out my faith in and through acts of service, acts of generosity, acts of kindness, acts of love, compassion, whatever word you want to use for it. But probably the place for me where these two came together in beautiful ways, and I kind of scratched my head and said, I didn't know there was any other way, was when I would lead folks on week-long missions trips and immersion experiences. We would start the day in scripture and in prayer, and then we would head out to serve. And in between those, we were usually gathering around a table and eating together. And then in the evening, after our day of serving, we would come together for worship and celebrate and name the places that we experienced God's presence. Without the Bible study in the morning and worship in the evening, would we have been doing good? Absolutely. But it wouldn't have been connected to who we are as followers of Jesus. It simply would have been an act of service, and there's a place for that. As followers of Jesus, we connect that to our faith. And the only way that I know how to do that is in reading the scriptures and in celebrating and worship and praying together so that we can continue the journey of becoming who God wants us to be. It's a holding together of the gritty facts of what's happening around us and the needs around us, and the gritty faith of what and who Jesus is inviting us to be.
Sara, sometimes I think it's easier to focus upon the faith, the gritty faith, because we're unsure about the gritty facts. It's easier on the inside than it is to be on the outside, and you've developed some tools that we have on Transforming Mission, the 7 missional questions. That's one of the ways that we can learn to be involved in the community or works of mercy, because we begin to understand the community, the assets and the needs. And then from the faith that we have in responding to God's grace, and then knowing what the need is in the community, we can make that connection. I was a part of a church at one time that with lots of prayer and lots of study, because that's who the church was, they prayer walk the community, not to do anything else other than to begin to understand the community. They discovered a whole a park where there was prostitution and drugs, but they began to walk around the park and engage conversation with people around the park. As they prayed and as they did study, going out and then meeting the people in the community, they actually, if I may say it this way, took the park back, and it became a place where children then were playing soccer, and where there were community meetings and things that began to take place. But that was a coming together of both a personal piety or personal faith and of acts of mercy, or beginning to engage the community.
And so you've probably already begun to understand what happens when you join these pairs together by what I call the power of and, the gritty facts and the gritty faith. What happens is there's room at the table for both the facts of what is going on and the creative work of the God we know that moves in and through us through Jesus and the Holy Spirit, calling us to a new place. And often that's in ways that we couldn't even think of to begin with. There's then space to rumble with vulnerability. And so in those places, to go back to the conversation around, well, we'll just use what you were just talking about, Tim. The simple act of going out on a prayer walk to a place where they've known that there was prostitution was an action of vulnerability. And then to come back and have conversations around, okay, so what are we going to do about it? Yeah, that requires a space of both being able to name the gritty facts and the gritty faith. I would suggest that when we're willing to rumble with vulnerability, we also have a better vision of the full expression of the body of Christ, because we aren't placing people in boxes or putting a label on them, but we're allowing them to live into their giftedness and be on a journey of growing in grace and growing to become who Jesus would have them be. And so they have the opportunity to both dream and, I'll use the phrase that you use often, to check what the current reality is, and to hold those in tension and to walk with other people while they're doing that.
So, in our conversation today, then, and what you have said so well, is that there is a big difference between our binary thinking of either or, and then bringing together our conversation with an and, because we already know that if we start on either end, or on our positions, or what we want to happen, and cannot come together and have conversation, there are always winners and losers. We begin to, and whether we intend to do it or not, because we're so passionate about our position, we begin to blame, which brings shame, or we begin to label people, which we stereotype people. We begin to say that because they think this way, they must also think this way, without ever having a conversation, because they don't say things the way we want them to say them. So we're no longer talking about relationship at that point. We've entered that period of protecting ourselves, where our world gets smaller, and as it gets smaller, we've got to protect what we have.
And so our hope is that you would step into rumbling with vulnerability and recognize both the gritty facts and the gritty faith necessary to do that. And so we want to end this episode and wrap it up by giving you two tools, which really come in the form of a question this time, to help you be able to live that out. So I want you to think about the conversations that we talked about in terms of those pairs of holding things together. And as you are having those conversations with folks, and you come to a place where there's a pause and you're ready to move forward, the two questions become, what are our key learnings, and what's my part? So, what are our key learnings? Really helps us to identify what are we taking forward from this conversation to continue living with and living into, so that we don't have to repeat what we just did every single time. So I'm going to go back to the example of finances and worship. That if we have established a place that from that experience, we have now learned, there are some other opportunities to be able to not only identify money, but express ourselves in and through the arts in worship. We can come back to that place and ask ourselves, if we've answered this question, what are our key learnings? So, at the risk of poking a bear, I'll just say it that way. Tim and I thought that we would have a conversation around our key learnings from the recent General Conference that has taken place in the United Methodist Church. Now, folks, I said I poke at the risk of poking a bear. My invitation to you is to hear what we offer as our personal reflections, and to not do what we just named in terms of labeling people, putting people in boxes, or placing an or in between it, but holding it in tension and holding it with care. So, what are our key learnings?
Well, Sarah, one of the things that I've learned is that we've not done a good job of conversation, of rumbling, and whether that's as pastors, local church leaders, maybe if we talk about it, maybe on all levels of the church, we've not cleared a space or created a space that would be safe psychologically, that could be safe for us to be able to express an opinion, and then somebody be able to engage us in conversation so that we can know what someone is saying. I mean, I've experienced this over my years of ministry, but I saw it more, and maybe that's part of what came forward as one of my learnings, is that because we don't rumble with each other, we're making assumptions about each other, and when we make those assumptions, we immediately put people into groups, and when we put people into groups, we've already decided whether we're going to talk with them or fight with them. And that's one of the
whether they're on my side
learnings.
Or whether they're the enemy.
Right. Right. That's another way of putting it. Right.
And so one of the things that I would say that I've learned is that we need both, as we've talked about it in this episode, the gritty facts and the gritty faith, especially in this time in the life of the church, so that we can stay focused on Jesus, our mission, and the future that we're living into, even as we speak. I witnessed the polarities that we talked about, and to be frank, it broke my heart, and I witnessed it on all sides. And the gritty facts and the gritty faith, I think, as I reflect on the experiences in ministry that I have had, and in the places where I have seen that happen and where I have seen leaders do that well, that becomes a conversation that is life-giving for everyone. And maybe I say it's life-giving for everyone because it takes you to a place that nobody could imagine when they first sat down. So the first question, what we just reflected on, were key learnings. The second question is, what's my part? And once you've named the key learnings, answering this question both in terms of what's my part in how we got to this place, and what's my part in then being able to move forward and live into the key learnings that we've identified. So if we were truly rumbling, Tim and I wouldn't just name our own. We would name our key learnings collectively as a group. Really, Tim and I did this around a table. You just didn't hear us doing that, and one of us just took one item, and one of us took another item. So you would do that work together to be able to name that, and what the key learnings of the group are. So, Tim, what's your part?
Well, putting it in the context of what you just said, as we talked around the table. I'm going to be intentional about providing time and space for pastors, particularly, to have conversation,
hey,
safe
you
conversation.
Stole mine. And
where when someone says that they are, if I may continue down the road of poking the bear, when somebody says, uses terms like traditional or progressive, or words like Wesleyan or Orthodox, that we can have a conversation to be able to say, well, what do you mean by that? Or tell me more about that. So that I can understand, so I can have clarity, so that what we're doing is not only having conversation, but we're developing the relationship that allows us to have the and instead of the or.
Yeah, and I would echo what you've said, and then I would take it down to Tim and I are working on that. We're meeting with our pastors in our area this Thursday collectively as groups of people. We're providing 2 opportunities. The other thing, my part in terms of moving forward, part of what I have said, and I've offered this because it's honestly the best way that I know that I can be of service to the church and to the kingdom at this point in time, that I know pastors that are having a hard time sorting through what is happening. And so my part in that is to make myself available as a coach to have those generative conversations, to work through that in a safe, confidential space that isn't with their board chair and isn't with someone in their congregation, but someone who can help them identify a place and how they're going to lead, knowing that there are people in every single one of our congregations that are in a variety of places, even if the culture of your local congregation may lean one direction or another. We need to lead well. And so my commitment is to helping pastors do that as best I am able and as best as God has equipped me. And when I think back on what's my part in terms of how did I contribute to us coming to this place, part of what I've recognized is I have probably, no probably about it, I have stayed quiet in places that I have needed to speak up. And so, yeah, I've stayed quiet. And that has to change.
Can I push you a little bit there?
Sure.
I was going to anyway. Being quiet, though, does not mean that you've necessarily not come down on one side or the other, but it's because you have not expressed whatever anxiety or creativity that you have to offer to a larger conversation.
I think you just identified why I did stay quiet, is that I don't find myself in the polarities. And so my not speaking up was, as I reflect back on it, a poor attempt, but my attempt to keep that space open to be able to be in community with people across theological diversity, across the theological spectrum, because that's the church that I stepped into. That's the church that I love. That's the church that I know. And where as I think about it, the places that I haven't spoken up is to always ask those clarifying questions. Tell me more. Help me understand what you're saying. When you're talking about getting back to orthodoxy or scriptural holiness, what does that mean to you? I need to hear you. I need to understand. When you're talking about a space for all, I can translate all of those things, and I know how that comes through my brain. But if I am not understanding what you mean by that, then we're not having a conversation, and we haven't created the space and the community that in my mind we have had as a church. And so my silence has contributed to perhaps a false sense of diversity and embracing people at different places on the theological spectrum within the United Methodist Church. Again, it hasn't even been a week, folks, so my thoughts are still being formed and will likely change. But to ask those 2 questions of what's my part and what are our key learnings, then we can move someplace new. Then we can move forward together. We can create spaces for people to have those conversations and learn from one another.
Sara, would you say, and I'm I know we're coming to a close on this podcast.
Oh, we're over our time. We're at 45 minutes already.
Would you say one of the things that can overcome the binary thinking is that regardless of where you come down on any kind of issue, if you do stand in the middle and ask questions on both sides to get the clarity, to create the space where there can be conversation, we can take the steps toward where we really want to be, where I think is what everybody keeps saying, where we really want to be, but we're all going there together in some way or another, instead of having winners and losers and people who are on the inside and on the outside. It's a matter of knowing yourself well enough that you do not have to always be the person in the center of everything, but you can take your place in the center so other people can have a place. Does that make sense?
It does. And I think the practical application of that for me is people who I have found myself in disagreement with are often the people who teach me the most, both about who God is and what I believe and why I believe it. They help me to articulate who I am and who God's inviting me to be. So I need people that press me and challenge me, and that I can learn from. It's real easy to stay with people who think exactly like you do. You feel really good all the time, and you don't end up growing much. I haven't found that growth happens when I am surrounded only by people who think exactly as I do. My dearest friends, we disagree all the time. And because we disagree all of the time, we can rumble in the places that help me understand why are you there? I see you're hurting because of that. I may not hurt in the same way, but I can see and I can recognize it. And when someone that I care about is hurting, then I hurt. And I don't have to think exactly as they do to experience that with them. That's what rumbling with vulnerability is being willing to step into those spaces that aren't always comfortable, but are always places where the gritty facts and the gritty faith come together.
Part of what we talk about a lot is around hope, which is more than wishful thinking. So what I want to say when I use the word hope here isn't wishful thinking, but what I'm working to have happen. And that is that we have healthy leaders who can step into the chaos and the anxiety and create a place where everyone can have the conversation so that we can be genuine followers of Jesus, where God's kingdom can come on earth as it is in heaven.
So let me remind you that you can find show notes at transformingmission.org/057. As you seek to rumble with vulnerability and create spaces and hold the space for your leaders and teams to hold that, the power of the gritty faith and the gritty facts that are necessary to rumble with vulnerability, it's now your turn to answer those two questions. What are your key learnings? And what's your part? And no, we're not just asking about General Conference. We're asking about your role in leading the church that God has invited you to lead in this time and place, in making disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. So once you've answered those two questions, then go lead a movement of Jesus followers. Bye for now.